Hello, welcome everyone to this afternoon's Open News meeting. I'm Basha Cummings, I'm an editor at Tortoise. As I think most of you know, we use these meetings once a week to talk about what's happening in the news, to address some of the things going on outside of our newsroom. But today I think we're going to talk more about the project that we've published this week and the issues that arise from it. So hopefully you'll all have seen that we've published a project called Hidden Homicides, which is an ambitious piece of investigative reporting from us that takes the form of a 4-part podcast series. And we've got Louise Tickle, who's the lead reporter on that project, here with us today. Hello, Louise. I'd like to talk about that, but I also like to talk about domestic abuse more broadly. It's a timely discussion because there is a landmark piece of legislation called the Domestic Abuse Bill, which is this week beginning its 5 days of committee stage scrutiny in the House of Lords, where they'll be picking over the detail, and we've got people here today who can talk to some of the amendments that might be going in and talk about how significant this piece of legislation might be. But I think it's also a moment for us to talk more broadly, more generally, about where we think our understanding and our sort of recognition of domestic abuse is. And because I was so struck last week with the reporting around the Phil Spector's death, the terrible headlines totally missing off the fact that he was also a murderer. And I think there's a sort of cultural conversation to be had about the fact that that's able to happen. I'd also like to just point out that we've got some people joining us today who've really formed a big part of our work on hidden homicides and who are really important to us in how we've told this story. So we've got Julie, Katie Wilding's mum, who, if you've listened to episode 1 and 2 of our podcast series, you'll have heard her voice and you'll have followed her story. She's here today and we'll hopefully hear more from her too. Professor Jane Moncton Smith, who is a forensic criminologist, an expert in domestic abuse, and has totally transformed this project and has given us direction and her expertise when we needed it. And so I'm really excited to speak to her. And we've also got Frank Mullane, who runs the charity Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse, who is another expert in this field who knows this stuff better than anyone and is also joining us. Of course, as ever, if you've got questions or points of view, do get involved. You can, my colleague Claudia is on the chat, so you can put there she is, hello. And she's also been key to this project, so Claudia will hopefully hear from you today as well. So you can put comments in the chat or you can raise your digital hand and I'll try and bring as many of you into the conversation as I can. So let's start with Louise. We don't need to maybe go into the sort of nitty-gritty detail of our investigation because that's all on our app and on our website, and hopefully our members and some of the people here today will have got through a couple of the episodes and seen some of it. But I'm curious, just to kick off the conversation, what was the most striking thing that you came across in doing this work, and how did it change your view of domestic abuse? Because you've been reporting on this for a decade. You know this terrain well. What surprised you in taking on this project?
The thing that I will always remember out of this investigation is watching the police interview of Katie Wilding's statement that she made the second time that they had rescued her from Mitchell Richardson, her by then ex-boyfriend. I have interviewed scores of domestic abuse victims in the past, but I've never seen the kind of inside story of how a police interview draws out the experiences that they have literally just been subjected to. These interviews are effectively their statements. They're the basis on which the police make a decision as to whether to prosecute, whether to charge somebody. And watching that young woman over the course of, 90 minutes, gradually unfold the story of what was textbook domestic abuse of a very violent and intimidating and humiliating kind. And how skilled, in fact, that particular officer was in not just drawing her out, but checking things back to make sure that they had the information needed for the other team to then question Mitchell Richardson. I mean, almost the second most striking thing is I then, although we haven't published any part of this, watched Mitchell Richardson's own police interview, where that part of the police protection team tried to find out from him his understanding of what had gone on. So I think for me that very special insight, some of which we've published, but obviously we didn't publish all of it, will never leave me.
And we tried in the podcast series, the disclaimer that I should put now is that I edited the series, so some of this is familiar to me, but I'm trying to take a step back here and ask questions that are kind of broader and not going straight into the detail. But one of the things that we tried to do in the podcast series was to sort of tell the story of your reporting of the project alongside the sort of the outcome of it and what you were discovering. So in that sense, we sort of, in the spirit of an open newsroom, we tried to let people into the process. And so I wondered if you could just speak about what that was like, sort of, I guess, showing your workings, which is not something that as journalists we're that used to. And as part of that, how did you come across these stories? How did you find Katie and Susan Nicholson's stories?
It has been really fascinating explaining how, as a journalist, you find your way through the difficulties, the thickets really, of the problems that you encounter at every stage, especially in a story like this, when you're trying to count something that nobody's counting, that is hidden. And part of what we are publishing is our conversations. And we recorded a lot of the conversations that were had between the team, thinking that we might publish some of them, which indeed we have. But also, it was interesting to me, really, to kind of look back and think, oh, how did I grasp the nub of this story? And, we have Professor Jane Moncton-Smith and her cat, I can see, with us. A lovely black cat. My cat's black, so I completely approve. And it was Jane, in fact, who I had interviewed once, some years ago, about a different domestic abuse story, who had tweeted. And in fact, that followed on from Frank Mullane, who's the chief executive of the charity Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse, who I knew was interested in the suicides that come after long sustained serious domestic abuse. And Jane tweeted last February, I think it was, about the research she's doing, really a deep dive into the case files of, I think it's 20, it might be more by now, hidden homicides or cases that might be hidden homicides. And I just got in touch with her. And we had this conversation, and what is always extraordinary to me is how much academics in this field are so willing to give you their time, because this isn't time that's paid for, this is their own time, and how they're willing to talk you through and discuss and really expand your understanding and help you see what might be worth pursuing and give you a sort of route map through. And then I wrote this impassioned email to a different editor, Dave Taylor at Tortoise, and they're always chaotic, these emails, when you've got something kind of really passionate that you're interested in, and they should be nicely honed, but this one I know wasn't. And then it was a process of trying to work out how to report something that's hidden, and finding the people whose daughters' stories could illuminate aspects of the system that weren't working. And Jane introduced me to Julie, and that was how it all started.
And just for those people who haven't yet had a chance to get into the project and into your reporting, just lay out for me what a hidden homicide is and how your understanding of it might have evolved throughout this project.
I started off thinking that these were killings that had simply been missed by the police, and that but it very soon became clear through conversations with Jane and Frank that there is a much more it's darker, it's less definable type of death, which is a suicide, which has been led up to by very serious domestic abuse. And suicide, as we say in the podcast, is a difficult, very sensitive topic, particularly for us to report, because making causative links is not approved of, because it's rare that there will ever be a single cause of somebody choosing to take their life. And so, we started off with this idea that a hidden homicide was a sudden, unexplained death that either hadn't been investigated as a homicide at all because the authorities simply didn't see the domestic abuse that concerns were being raised about, or indeed that they had on record as being of any relevance to the kind of death they were seeing, which might have been a drugs overdose or an apparently obvious accident or seemingly natural causes. But it then evolved to thinking about how that the mental state of somebody who has been subjected to, well, I can only really call it torture from the domestic homicide reviews that I've read into women who have undergone this kind of abuse, because it is torture over years often, and then their choice to take their own life. And that's perhaps one of the most sensitive, difficult elements of the story to report. But we did, in fact, in the end, after long conversations, grasp the nettle and choose to go there.
One of the things that we were really keen to do as part of this investigation was to look at the data, because, you know, in the same way that there are sort of individual cases that you can get into and you can find sort of specific examples of police failings, or, you know, you can match those up with other cases and see that there's a pattern. We also wanted to try and get a sense of a national scale here. How many hidden homicides are we really talking about? And I don't think anyone will contest me saying that it was the most frustrating and difficult part of this project, and it was something that we asked poor Patricia Clark, who's a data journalist at Tortoise, to take on. And I set her two tasks. One was to find out and tell me what data exists, what do we count nationally, and then to find what we don't. So Patricia, I wonder, would you mind just talking first through what we count as a country when it comes to domestic abuse?
So the caveat before I begin is that all of this is incredibly complicated. And the data on domestic abuse is very piecemeal. So we've got, in terms of actual cases, we've got the ONS, which produces a report every year around domestic abuse. And so they said in 2019, I think it was 1.6 million women were subjected to domestic abuse, around 700,000 men, I understand. But then there are other reports that say, okay, but these numbers are actually massively, they don't capture the full picture, because only about 18% of these cases are actually reported. So that's what we know in terms of the scale of domestic abuse within our society. And then for this particular project, what we've been looking at in particular is intimate partner homicides. So we're looking at, and we've chosen to look specifically at women who are killed by men. And the data around that is really, really tricky, because we've got the ONS and also the ONS does England and Wales data, and they report on how many women are killed by partner or ex-partner. We don't necessarily know the gender of that partner. We've got the Scottish government does something similar, as is the Northern Irish government. And then we've got something called the Femicide Census, which was produced by Karen Gala-Smith and her team. And they look at women who are killed specifically by men, what's known as femicide, and they produce a count. But these are only cases where it's clear that a man has killed a woman. And what we're talking about in hidden homicides is that there are cases that the police are missing. So in terms of my question of how do we find this data, we're saying it's not counted at all. So from a data perspective, it was really, really tricky, because I thought, well, how do we just sort of try and just try and get a sense of the scale of this issue? So what we came up with as a team was to start looking at the police and say, okay, let's try and figure out how many women have died suddenly or unexpectedly, and how many of those women have a domestic abuse marker attached to their history, their name, their partner, and so on. And then we can maybe start to build a picture of what this is like. And I don't know if you want me to go into it now, Basha. And then what came out of that was just this incredible sense of disjointed data. And it's clear that we're not recording this in any way at all.
I would like to talk about what came back to you, because the way that we went about it was that we FOI'd every police force in the UK for this data. We asked them a very specific question. Could you just sort of briefly go sort of, what did you get back? What was the majority of response like? Where did it kind of point you?
Yeah. So one of the things when we were putting together this question, the biggest question I think for us was, how do the police flag domestic abuse? And so Louise had heard that maybe they flag the victim every time someone rings up and reports it. Other people had said, well, maybe they flag the perpetrator. Maybe they flag the phone number of the person who's reported the crime. Maybe they flag their address. And so when we were putting this together, we sort of tried to ask a question broad enough that captured all of those different ways that the police record domestic abuse. And then what we got back was a very clear sense of the fact that they have no national way of flagging domestic abuse. Every single force does it differently. Some of them will attach it to the specific case. So we got, I think it was 25 refusals, where they said, some of them said, we don't have this information, we can't think of a way for you to narrow it down. Some of them said, we do have this information, but in order to find it, we'd have to go case by case and read these reports in the way that we've done for hidden homicides. You know, we've looked at specific cases, and that's how we flag domestic abuse. And then a few others have said, yeah, we can provide the numbers. They did it. 8 police forces provided us a full set of data saying, here's how many women died unexpectedly, here's how many of them had domestic abuse history. And even those numbers, I mean, it's quite difficult to analyze it as just 8 pieces of data, but those numbers vary wildly. And we don't know whether that's because they're just not reporting it correctly, or whether that's just the state of domestic abuse in those forces.
And so what would we need to create a national count? What would we need to happen? Because that's something that we've identified as part of our kind of call to action, that we know that as a result of this investigation, we know that some things need to change. But from a data perspective, what would we need to change for us to be able to nationally count the number of women who are known to be or suspected to be suffering from domestic abuse, who die suddenly or in unexplained circumstances?
So what we're calling for in this project is for the government to report these numbers, to report the number of women who died unexpectedly and their domestic abuse histories. What we don't have in any of the national data, except for the Femicide Census, which is a charitable effort, is something that explicitly links domestic abuse and homicide. So I think that we need to start collecting those numbers as they exist now. And then structurally, I also think that those will give us an indication, but a lot has to change beyond that. I think, as I said earlier, some sort of national consensus on how we flag these things, how we collect these things so that they're easily searchable, is really, really important. And I think that we need different institutions to speak to each other as well. We need better consensus across the healthcare system, the criminal justice system, and so on.
Brilliant. Well, I think you did a very good job of explaining what was, I know, an incredibly complicated and pretty frustrating process. I'd love to come to Jane Moncton Smith, who I believe is here with, I'm not sure if you still have your cat. Cat's gone. Oh no, there, great. A very welcome guest. Hello, I feel like I've listened to your voice so much over the last few months, so it's very nice to see you. A lot of what Louise and Patricia have just described will be familiar to you, Jane, and I know that you've been studying this stuff for a long time. So I know you've had a chance to listen to episodes 1 and 2. I'd love to just know how what we found reflects what you've been studying for the last decade.
I haven't actually had a chance to listen to episode 2 yet. I've been on meetings all morning, but I will be listening to it this afternoon. But you know, I've had lots of conversations with Louise, and I think we both absolutely is going to shock everybody. So, you know, when you're talking about a sudden death, I have cases where the death has been recorded as natural causes or through illness, just because there's a lack of information. So even if you ask the police if they were going to identify what was a suspicious death, they probably wouldn't include half of the ones that we would. And as you'll hear from Julie's case, Katie's death, even when concerns are raised, they are not listened to. So there's so many deaths being recorded as misadventure, or all of these other things. There would have to be a sea change in thinking, especially police and coroners, by the way. It's not always the police that are failing to recognise, in saying, okay, we agree that there's something suspicious here. And I just don't, I don't know how we're going to make that leap. I think that anybody who has had domestic abuse in their background and then they suddenly die unexpectedly, for whatever the explanation is, there should be some kind of check and balance just to look at that death and see if there is anything suspicious.
I'd like to come to the sort of campaign points that we've developed as a result of this report later. But I wanted to just ask you, Jane, because there's a point in episode 1 where you talk so brilliantly about the low status of domestic abuse victims, which really stuck with me, because the thing that you can see when you listen to Katie's story and to Susan Nicholson's story is just a sort of not least a lack of curiosity and a sort of drive to really check the abuser's story, to check it out and to see if it really, but a lack of empathy and a lack of care. And I wonder, you made the brilliant point about low status. Can you just explain a bit more about how you see that cropping up in your research?
Low status is probably, and I think Frank will probably back me up on this, low status is the single biggest issue. And this has been raised by Professor Evan Stark as well, who's a world leader in this area. But we've got low status coming in at 2 levels. So we've got the low status of domestic abuse as a crime, as something to understand. Everybody has this kind of feeling in the back of their head that domestic abuse is about, oh, these 2 people had a fight that got out of hand, and that is not how these homicides are happening. So we need to raise the status of domestic abuse. And the second level is the low status afforded to victims of domestic abuse. And it's, a lot of people will argue that men have low status too. And given that the second largest group really are gay men, I think that they do suffer low status. So women and gay men and children are suffering a lack of status. And I suppose a third layer then is the very low status of the families after a death who are raising concerns and are not listened to.
Yeah, and I mean, you can hear that very much in Louisa's episodes, where the kind of constant rebuffing of families, not taking seriously their suspicions. I wonder then, Jane, with that understanding of how domestic abuse is treated and the victims are treated, how you read headlines like those that came up around Phil Spector's death, how you see that play out in kind of popular culture.
Well, when I see headlines like that, I'm absolutely outraged, but I don't see that outrage across society. I'm outraged, and victims of domestic abuse are outraged, and people who know about these things are outraged, but we aren't forming the majority. Because people think that these are things that happen spontaneously and the spur of the moment, I can see why when they keep having that narrative repeated and repeated and repeated in the media, irrespective of what the actual circumstances were, you're just building on that low status. This is a fight that got out of hand. She should have left. Yeah, it's a real problem, but I do think that media headlines, Janie Starling did a really good piece of work campaigning to have a journalist code of conduct. And there is a code of conduct, but it's not enforced. I think, you can follow it if you want to. And I don't think the link has been made between those headlines and actually empowering domestic abusers who think that they're kind of justified.
Mm. Thank you, Jane. I'd love to bring Julie in now, because Julie, are you there? Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us. Another voice who I've been kind of living with for the last month. Very nice to see you, and thanks for joining us. You've done an incredible thing to speak to us with such detail and openness, and you know, your story is just remarkable for so many reasons. This thing that Jane is talking about, the low status, is something that I know that you've fought against, you experienced it firsthand. Just tell us how you experienced dealing with the police from the moment of Katie's death.
Well, from day one, I mean, they arrive at your house, they give you this earth-shattering news, and they leave. And that's fine, you know, that's their job. From there on in, we seemed to have to battle for every piece of information. We were telling the police things that they weren't aware of. And when we were raising our worries, our concerns, I will give you an example that Mitchell's mother gave me Katie's car, house, flat keys, a handbag. She gave me those from the crime scene. And when we asked the police about this, we were sort of patted on the head and so told, no, that's fine. You know, you don't really understand how these things work. Even to the point when we raised a complaint, we went through our MP, we raised a complaint about the police. We got a letter back from always get this wrong, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Devon and Cornwall. We had a letter back from her, and somebody she'd had look into it said, "You're a grieving family. You don't understand how the process works." You just feel yourself up against a brick wall, and you feel very lonely. We didn't have Avta, Frank, or Jane in our lives at this point, and you feel incredibly lonely, incredibly undermined. And it does make you feel like you either become very paranoid or that you're going mad.
So in a way, your grief was used against you to keep you out of the process, and to keep you, it's really shocking. I'm curious. So it was, I think, a new experience for you to work so closely with a reporter and sort of tell your story in this way. What was the process like for you? How has it been to listen to these episodes and to sort of see your story played back to you in some way?
Meeting Louise was amazing, and I tried to explain this very badly to her the other day. When we met, something just clicked for me, and I trusted Louise. I mean, obviously I'd looked into her background a little, as you do, but I just felt I could trust Louise, and she's always kept me completely informed of everything, just sending a little email just to say, look, we're going to include this, just make sure you know, just so you know. Listening to them yesterday, or the first one yesterday, of course it's very hard, but I seem to have this ability. I've told Katie's story often. For me, I can tell it and I don't get emotional very often, but to hear somebody else tell Katie's story, to have people like Jane believe us and help us and support us after years of being told, no, you're wrong, it's very overwhelming. And all of my family are just so grateful to Louise and for Tortoise and everybody who've done this so well. They're not dramatizing it, they're just telling it very simply, and it's been an incredible experience, and I'm actually really proud of what has achieved. And having seen some of the outcomes that you want, I cried then. I said to Louise, I don't cry very often, but I cried then. It's very powerful. Thank you.
I'm so pleased to hear that. I think that was at the forefront of everyone's minds, I think, is to do the story justice. But I wanted to ask you about what next, because I know that sort of late on in our process, you got a good piece of news about something that you've been fighting for. So just talk me through what's sort of next in your fight to try and get answers.
Well, we were late to the show really with this. We didn't know anything. We went through our inquest after 15 months. We were still on our own, still not happy. We'd had our police complaint come back. No, we hadn't, not at that point. Sorry, confusing myself. And eventually we met Frank from advocacy after fatal domestic abuse. And for over 2.5 years now, we've been fighting tooth and nail, and Frank will tell you, Jane will tell you how much of a fight this has been, to get a review into the circumstances leading up to Katie's death. And it's not about looking at what happened on the night, it's just getting agencies to acknowledge that maybe they want to do things better, or they could do things better if they had more money, if they had training. And we finally got that on the 8th of December, which was the 4-year anniversary of Katie's death. And it's been a real fight, but we're going to get there. And it's looking at how we can change. It's looking at making changes so that we can prevent future vulnerable Katies from dying. And that's been our passion in our family, and that's what keeps me going. And that's why I did the interview with Louise. And we just need to get that out there. Once we've got that, it's not going to bring Katie back. It doesn't change anything for us. But if we feel that Katie's story can help other young vulnerable women, and I always use women because that's my passion, then I think it's a legacy for her, isn't it? So that's the hope for our future.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Well, I hope that you are able to try and get the police to really look at how they dealt with this case. I'd like to come to a couple of people who are participating in the chat, because there's one point made earlier by Yasmin that I just wanted to come back to about just the comparison with how rigorously the government collects data on other things and yet not on this issue. Yasmin, I just wondered whether you'd be happy to make that point again and expand on it if you're there.
Yes. I just thought, and Chris sort of mentioned something else I thought was interesting around the idea of incentives, but I just think that, like, it's clear that governments and police departments have the capacity to do this, to collect the data, to make it a priority. But sorry about the background noise. But it's clearly a case of, whether you want to call it low status or whether you want to call it the impact of a society that generally doesn't value women and women in general, and their safety and so on. And again, I speak mostly about women. I don't really have much more articulate or anything more profound to say, but I think it's infuriating and frustrating, because it's not that it is not possible, but that it is not cared about and that it is not a priority. And also, I think, it's interesting we talk about the police, because I think, the police are not separate from the society that this happens in. There are many cases where the perpetrators are policemen themselves, and that makes it even more difficult. The sort of, from, again, I'm not an expert in this space, but from my sort of understanding, it does seem that this is a part of a broader cultural issue that feeds into all the things we're talking about, feeds in the fact that the families and friends and so on have to advocate on their behalf, and there is very little direction and support apart from charities and volunteers and so on to do that work. Underlying all of this is that it is possible to do something about this. But where is the priority? Where is the incentive? Where is the fact this is not something you can make money out of? This is not something that's going to increase the power of people who are already in power. It's something that's just about protecting some of the most vulnerable people. If your home is not safe, if the people who say they love you don't treat you with love and respect, then you are incredibly vulnerable. And we're not interested in protecting those people. And even once they are no longer with us, we don't care. Like, what else is there? Yeah,
I think that's a really good point, and it's one that actually Jess Phillips has made in an op-ed that she wrote for us today, the MP. She just simply makes the point that a society counts what it cares about, and the fact that we don't count this is a pretty damning reflection on us. I wondered if I could come to Chris Cook, who made a good point a little earlier about the kind of the incentive problem in this. Chris, do you want to just expand on that? Nice hair.
I know. Sorry, it's a few weeks into lockdown. I think the structural problem you're dealing with is this one, that it kind of works. Given a crime has happened, it kind of works for everyone to be able to present the crime as this moment of unforeseeable crisis and tragedy, and to not reveal the extent to which a prior intervention might have prevented the outcome. And it also works for the police not to have to worry about a new thing they have to detect, right? It's like it works for them to have a lower volume of crime, to be serious crime to be worrying about. So I think the in a sense, the likely solution is that it has to be an outside entity that forces the police to do this, and whether that is legislation or it's coroners saying, actually, I mean, the point of the coroner system is precisely that, right? The point of the coroners is to say, we need an independent person who can tell us whether this death opens a question about and has been fairly reflected. If the coroners are not currently under this current situation able to get to those points, and things aren't being brought to them sufficiently with the right evidence, then it's a political question, right? I think.
Yeah, Jane, I wonder what you think of that. Does that tally with your sort of reading?
Yeah, but as I said earlier, the coroners aren't asking the questions either. Are they asking, and in some cases it has been, coroners are difficult, and they will sometimes side with the agencies against families, which I'm sure, Frank and Julie will attest to. So, if there was an unexplained death, like one I was dealing with, where the police weren't even called, and the argument was actually with the coroner. So when somebody dies young, unexplained, suddenly, what questions is the coroner asking about domestic abuse? Because it seems to me they're not asking those questions.
I'd like to come to Frank Mullane now, who is a real expert on all of this stuff, and I'd love to, in our final 20 minutes, to talk about the domestic abuse bill. It's now being debated in the Lords. Can you just sort of, for those who haven't been following this topic closely, just sort of tell us what this bill will do and why it's so significant?
Well, first of all, domestic abuse is not a crime in name. Now, this bill is not going to change that, but because it's not a crime in name, I think that's partly what gives it low status. Even having a DA bill, as big as it is making it, is giving it, it's going to recognise children in domestic abuse for, I believe. Also an attempt to try and get it to recognise unborn and young babies is another set of amendments that people are trying to put through to recognise the domestic abuse that's visited on those persons, unborn and young babies, right in the first 2 years of life, so to speak. We are hoping that it's going to include, and I feel quite confident about this now, and let me just put in a word for Louise. You said that Louise Tickle was a great journalist. She's also very well connected. I got a meeting with a senior politician. I thought, I know I can boast about this to Louise. I told her, and she said, oh yeah, he's a great mate of mine. So, yeah. We are really hoping to get non-fatal strangulation into this bill, a separate criminal offence, which will follow New Zealand, Australia, and parts of America. We're so pleased. We brought lots of evidence in, and we're starting to see the tide turn. There was a possibility that it was going to go into another bill, which is coming to Parliament this year. There's always a risk that the champions that we have in place now might move around in any parliamentary reshuffle and you lose your sort of influence. But I would be so pleased if non-fatal strangulation, but there's a whole raft of other things being recognised in the DA bill, which overall will have the status of, have the effect, I hope, of lifting the status of domestic abuse. The more we do stuff like this, like the introduction of domestic homicide abuse back in 2011 and the gradual permeation of the language with that terminology, it just means it's on the agenda. When a local authority gets round, domestic abuse has to be on the agenda now. Because if somebody is killed, at least if it's a homicide or a suicide, they're supposed to spend money on it, local money, by the way. So I just think that, it kind of forces the culture. The more we bring in initiatives and bills and stuff like this, we begin to permeate the landscape with more language, more structure, more infrastructure, more cultural understanding of it and people getting more used to it, which hopefully will counter some of the negative things that Jane had mentioned, some of the negative things out there in society about domestic abuse. People see it mythically as sort of closed doors. I wanted to add something to that. I also think, Jane, that there is shame, because many of the people expressing it, of course, might be pretty good practitioners of it too, and many of them suffering it.
And so it's really good that the non-fatal strangulation is going to be attached to the domestic abuse bill. But I wanted to ask you also about, and I know this is a difficult topic to talk about, but there was a landmark prosecution last year that which criminally linked domestic abuse with suicide. It was a successful prosecution for manslaughter, which would not only, change things for future victims and perhaps suggest that we could have more prosecutions which draw a legal criminal link between domestic abuse and a suicide. That would change how we think about this whole topic. It would change what we're talking about when we're talking about hidden homicides, and it would presumably create much bigger numbers. Has there been a movement that you know of, Frank, to try and get suicide caused by domestic abuse linked to the domestic abuse bill, or is that something that's still a way off?
Well, I began a campaign to do that, but I'm afraid my energies then had to be redirected onto the non-fatal strangulation, and I decided that I couldn't influence the same set of people well by diluting my applications to their interest, if you like. So I'm going to start making inquiries about that now. I'm not sure that I will succeed, and it might not be the route that I have to go down, but I have submitted evidence to 3 parliamentary committees on why the police need to be investigating these deaths, where there is a history of domestic abuse. Whether it's been reported or not is irrelevant. If there's been a history of domestic abuse, they should be curious, and they are not. Problem. What concerns me is that despite the brilliant work of Hertfordshire Police in the case of Stephen Gain, who was convicted of coercive control of Kelly Sutton after she took her life, is I don't see that practice being elsewhere. What I'm hearing is, and even to be fair to some of these frontline police officers who aren't particularly well trained, they're looking for the obvious. They're looking to see if anybody else is in danger. See 2 dead bodies sometimes are a joint intoxication. They're not thinking about, has there been a crime committed here? And that's what really concerns me. So it's partly, I think, they are not trained. I have heard extraordinarily, almost stupid responses by police officers to scenes of crime, where you'd have thought, wow, I thought you'd have had a bit more curiosity than that. And the problem is, if the investigation is not made there and then and the crime scene preserved, it compromises all manner of things going forward. A truthful and full inquest, for example. It could compromise any legitimate claim that the family had for financial remedy if there were children left, for example. The whole thing is compromised. And actually, a guilty person capable of inflicting homicide or death on people via suicide is walking free. Not in all cases, but there may be some cases where that person is walking free. And do you mind if I mention, you didn't give me an invitation to go on like this, but do you mind if I do a second to mention about the Morn case in inquests?
Absolutely.
I think this is so important. So the Supreme Court this year said that coroners can now find unlawful killing on the balance of probability. Last year, a lower court had accepted that you could find suicide. Sorry about that, friend. The lower court had decided that you could find suicide on the balance of probability. Now, when you had suicide and unlawful killing at different standards of proof, there was a problem, because it could mean homicides could be dressed as suicides and easily passed off in an inquest because of the lower standard of proof. But
Yeah.
now they are the same standards. We tried to intervene in the Supreme Court, but it was rejected, but we still put submissions in. But luckily, the Supreme Court has lowered it. And this has got huge implications, because families, I think, are going to be telling us in inquest, look, Frank, we want you to ask the coroner, we want a conclusion, as they're called now, of unlawful killing. Physically, it's a suicide. So you could say, well, my conclusion is suicide. But given that you can now also find unlawful killing on the balance of probability, you don't need incontrovertible proof anymore. We invite you to conclude that as well. Maybe they're going to conclude two conclusions. We don't know. It's new ground post-mortem, which is now law. And of course, what that means is, and I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, and even the lawyers don't know, because it's fresh ground, it's brand new. I am imagining that we might say to coroners, look, we want the police to reinvestigate this for outstanding criminality. Now, the police might object and say, well, you're only finding it on the balance of probability. A court has to find it beyond reasonable doubt. What we would be saying is, yes, but if you look hard enough, you might find the missing evidence which allows you to put the case in reasonable doubt. But it requires you to look. It requires you to be curious. It requires you to preserve the crime scene. It requires you to put resources into this enterprise. It requires you to recognize higher status for these people. If you accept all of those things, it means that when you first go to the house of these horrors, you will put in place the best set of opportunities for the higher aims of justice to be achieved. Can I put it that way?
Yes. Well, that what you just spoke about there, that sort of those points that it will force, better collection of evidence, a different attitude from the police when they arrive on a scene, tallies very closely with the sort of campaign points that we've come to at the end of this investigation, that we believe, in conversation with you all, we believe we have, should push for change, but also can be changed. So Louise, I wonder, do you want to just talk through the kind of 3 things that you've identified that you think we should all sort of get behind and push in various ways to see happen?
Yes. First of all, though, I want to say that we're reporting at the very extreme end of what can happen to a victim of domestic abuse. I think it's really important to say we don't just count what we care about. We, as a society, we resource what we care about. And it doesn't seem to me that as a society, we really care very much about the risks that domestic abuse victims face day in, day out, because we don't protect them very well. Every police officer I've ever spoken to talks about resources, and it sounds really trite, people bleating on about resources, but there is absolutely no possibility of taking the time and care that you need as a public protective authority to protect victims of this kind of abuse without having time. We can't do this kind of investigation without heavy resourcing of it, and this investigation has been heavily resourced so we could take the time to do it in a way that we were comfortable with and that we felt was accurate and rigorous. We have cut refuges, we have cut police officers, we have cut benefits to women who try to go to refuges. We, as a society, we are not understanding that the financial cost, let alone the incalculable human cost, is being borne by really vulnerable people. And I should point out their children, many of whom become subject to care proceedings, for instance, which means that they lose their relationships with their siblings, with their families. Some are adopted. That means those relationships are lost forever. The trauma being borne by hundreds of thousands of people, probably millions, actually, if you extend that out to children, is just immense. So we don't want these dead bodies. We would like things to start, a difference to start being made way before you get to the point that a journalist has to read a domestic homicide review detailing page upon page of mental and physical torture. Having said that, the campaign aims that we want to push forward are quite simple, but they come as a result of all the conversations that we've had with various people. And I can feel now that when you say there's 3 of them, I'm going to forget the third. So somebody will have to step in and help me. But the first one that we want is that if police or other authorities turn up at the scene of a sudden or unexplained death, don't just keep an open mind. If you know that there is a record of domestic abuse, you need to treat that as a homicide, because by treating it as a homicide, all the things go in place that you need to draw on later. It means that the scene is secured. It means that statements are taken. It means that a forensic post-mortem is automatically put in place rather than the much cheaper standard one, which doesn't get you the level of evidence that you would need if it later turns out that the family's suspicions or your record keeping giving rise to your suspicions turn out to have been worth pursuing. It means that that evidence isn't lost and that answers can be had. We also want society to start counting. We want the resources to be put into trying to wriggle our way towards an understanding of the scale of this problem, because you can't count hidden homicides, at least you can't at the moment because they're hidden. What you can start to understand is how many sudden or unexplained deaths are happening, where there's a history of serious domestic abuse, and where those deaths haven't been investigated as homicides. And I knew that I was going to forget the third one, and I have.
That's okay. I have it here. It's about quick access to records.
Yes. So the Home Office in 2016, so 4 years ago, they looked over all the domestic homicide reviews that had been commissioned so far, and they looked to see the incidents of particular failings that were common. And third on that list was a failure to share information, and it sounds so boring. Information sharing is not, a fun topic. But what it means is if agencies don't share information, they cannot know, police cannot know when they arrive at a scene what level of abuse somebody may have been subjected to, because only 18% of domestic abuse victims ever report to police. They might mention it to their GP once or twice. They might inform their child's school, or their child's school might have safeguarding concerns about a child because of domestic abuse. They might have turned up to A&E with an injury that someone has managed to winkle out of them was related to an abusive incident. But that is not information that is quickly available to the first responder at the scene of a sudden or unexplained death. And I've had conversations with police officers who've said that would actually be a real game changer in how an incident is looked at, because you start to shape your understanding of someone's life much better in that first golden hour.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, we're going to share the campaign points, and there's going to be multiple ways for people to sort of get behind that. So I'll get Claudia to, she's already put the link in, there you are, if you want to read more about these things that we're pushing for. We're almost out of time, and I'd like to come back to Julie, because I think, we'll all agree that Julie's story and the way she tells it and the passion and conviction behind your participation in this project has been amazing. And I wonder what you ask of us as people who have, invested time and to try and understand this issue. What do you think that we should do next? We've laid out the problem. I wonder what you would like us to do next.
You, as I said earlier, your things that Louise has just been talking about made me cry, and I don't cry very often. I don't allow myself that. That's what I need you to fight for. There are other things that you've got in there that coroners need full training, police need full training. It's just awareness. It's awareness that these things are hidden. It's awareness that it happens to normal families like mine. It doesn't need to be somebody who's sleeping on the street. It just needs to be that the normality of this becomes the unnormal, and that we stop talking about hidden homicides. We start talking about the victims, the lives that they led, the happy people that they were, and they got dragged into this world. We need to stop brushing domestic abuse under the table. And it's agencies like yourself that can do such a wonderful thing that you've done with these. I'm very proud to have been part of this, and I can't thank you guys enough for it, to help people see that these are not just stories. They're real people. And if we can impact some lives in the future about little Katie, my little Katie, then you guys are doing an amazing thing. Thank you.
Thank you. So finally, Louise, we've talked about we've done 4 episodes so far. We know that we hope the domestic abuse bill will become we'll get its ascent later this year, hopefully by the summer, so we know that things are about to change. If we're going to do an episode 5 and 6, if we're going to keep going on this, what are you going to cover? What's the next step?
Well, this is just a little kind of flag as to what's going to be in episode 4. We are going to hopefully look at one particular police force which did come back to us with full data and showed really quite astonishing numbers of of unexplained sudden deaths of women who had been subject to domestic abuse which hadn't been investigated as a homicide. I am very interested in, there's going to be 2 inquests over the course of this year which families have fought for tooth and nail, which we may go and cover. Those inquests are to do with what Frank was talking about, suicides where families are going to be fighting, we think, for unlawful killing verdicts. And I am always really interested in the individual human stories of people who have fought really hard to make a difference, particularly in officialdom. And there's one of those that we might pursue, because it takes a lot of courage to do that, a lot of commitment, a lot of time and effort and advocacy.
Great. Well, listen, I think we're basically out of time. I'd like to end by saying there are ways for you all to get involved if you've listened to episodes 1 and 2, and we'll keep publishing throughout the week. You can write to your MP, you can join our campaign. That there are various ways, if you felt moved or enraged or impassioned by this reporting, to push for change. We know that there are serious things going wrong. Louise has laid them out. We know that there are clear things from the moment police turn up on the scene right the way through to the way that police forces collect data. And I think we can see a way forward for our reporting, and we're committed to stay on this issue. I'd like to thank hugely Frank and Jane, and especially Julie, for joining us and for talking about, with such openness and expertise. It's really such a pleasure to hear from you. And please do listen to the episodes, share them with everybody you know, and really get behind this, because as Julie says, these are stories, but they're also lives and people, and it's worth giving them a proper audience and getting people behind this. Thank you all for joining, and see you on the next Thinking.